The Ukrainians, cornered, made the difficult decision to surrender. One by one they emerged from the basement, their eyes fixed on the barrels of the Russian rifles. Their only hope was a prisoner exchange, an uncertain ticket home. But then something changed. Russian fingers slid onto the triggers. The sharp crack of betrayal echoed through the village, and the ground was stained with blood. The massacre inflamed the fury of Kiev's troops. The village became a field of vengeance, and, in the chaos, the ancient enemy of the Russians emerged. The Russians had already taken control of much of the small town of New York south of Torets, with their high-explosive aerial bombs being continuously dropped by their planes. The weakening of the Ukrainian defenses encouraged the invaders to advance more and more rapidly to the north. Russian drones burned enemy equipment that tried to support the defenders. The situation became critical for the Ukrainians. By the end of August, practically the entire city had been taken. The Russians were almost ready to join the Eastern Front, which already dominated Pivinitin. The American Bradley armored vehicles, operated by men from the Skala Battalion, tried to support the Ukrainian forces, who at that moment were completely surrounded. The Bradley's Bushmaster cannon fired shells at what was left of the buildings in New York. The Skala soldiers, all volunteers from the assault battalion, spread out among the houses, carrying out the clearing operation that would open a path for the Ukrainians to escape. They went from house to house, throwing grenades into basements and bathrooms, while the Bradley fired more heavy ammunition at the Russians. The Bradley advanced when it identified a concentration of Moscow's soldiers in the buildings. Its fire had to be continuous to protect the assault group that had just disembarked. The target was the enemy still alive inside the houses. They moved through the buildings, throwing grenades and heavier explosives. In one of the buildings, a Russian resisted longer than expected. A Ukrainian threw a grenade through the window. Another explosion ensured that the soldier was eliminated. The enemy tried to surprise the assault group. The drone alerted them over the radio, putting the soldiers on alert. The Russian aimed his rifle at the Ukrainians, but Skala's AKs were faster, firing rounds into the enemy's body. He joined the other fallen scattered through the streets. Skala's soldiers walked to the house where the last enemy was hiding. The rifles tore through the windows until the ammunition ended the invader's life. Explosions from Skala's drones sowed chaos among the Russian assault groups who were trying to maintain the siege on New York. Skala was facing the soldiers of the 9th Motorized Rifle Brigade. They had been attacking New York for months, forced to advance quickly. One of them was Lieutenant Mykola Volodymyrovich, now in command of the assault groups in the city. It was ironic how he had ended up there. Mobilized in 2022, he saw it as an opportunity. After serving his sentence in 2015, civilian life didn't offer him many options. Born in Donetsk in 1989, Mykola was actually in the average age range of current Russian soldiers, unlike in 2022 when there were many more young people. He survived since then, and now commanded the men of the Penal Battalion within the 9th Brigade. It was this group of misfit soldiers or criminals who preferred war over prison that Mykola ordered to get ready. The planes were in the sky again, cutting through the clouds to drop more bombs on New York. The high-explosive aerial bomb came down violently on the city. Some hit buildings, others exploded in the trenches next to the rows of houses. The drones took off to finish the job. Their special cameras detected the Ukrainians hiding. The explosives fell before many could notice, causing more deaths. The weakening of morale and the number of defenders gave Mykola a chance to launch another assault on the trench. The soldiers found the Ukrainians surrounded. They knew there was little chance of surviving the encirclement, even with Skala trying to free them. Surrender was the only viable option. One by one, they left the shelter. The Russians threw grenades to make sure no one else was hiding. After the explosions, they fired all the way to the back of the place. Those surrendered men were lucky. They were on the edge of the city and were sent to the prisoner exchange bank. Russian drones kept pressing the Ukrainians. The siege persisted, threatening soldiers who couldn't retreat in time. The orders were to advance without delay. It seemed like an apocalyptic schedule to be followed by the Russians. Withdraw, blow up, kill, set up position, proceed, repeat. The Ukrainians sent a squad of special forces to help. Their heavy fighters destroyed the buildings where the Russians were positioned. The powerful shots tore through the walls weakened by the bombings. The ammunition went through windows, shattering the inside of the apartments. Under the protection of the vehicles, the squad advanced. The grenade was the doorbell. They entered after the explosion. The rifles cleared paths on the stairs. But some explosions were necessary to dislodge the Russians. One of the Moscow soldiers ended up surrendering. Even that wasn't enough to stop the Russian explosions. Both the scale and the special forces sent were small groups and could do little to help. Mykola sent more soldiers amid the detonations caused by drones and bombs. The attack surprised the Ukrainian forces in retreat. The grenades took down some of the soldiers, making the extraction even more tense. Kamikaze drones and grenade launchers kept hunting the surrounded Ukrainians. Among the soldiers sent by Mykola was Vyacheslav Delyadin Gennadievich. Born in 1976, he was mobilized in 2022 and survived more than 2 years of war. Unlike Mykola, he wasn't there because he wanted to be. He had a good job when he received the mobilization letter. The choice was war or prison. He left his wife, children, and a newborn granddaughter to go to the front. Over the years, he learned not to disobey orders in the Russian army, advance and advance, carrying out orders by stepping over the bodies of Ukrainians or Russians. It didn't matter. Vyacheslav was sent in one of the assaults against the surrounded Ukrainians. It seemed too easy, but then explosions started erupting from the ground in front of the vehicles. The air in New York was pure smoke. Vyacheslav landed with his squad, made the group hurry, and survived for 2 years because he never stayed out in the open. That was life, watching the world explode while running away from the blasts, always moving forward. The attack could have been a complete failure, but some squads managed to infiltrate between the houses. That opened up space for the final attack against the Ukrainians trapped in the circus. Russian grenades flew through the windows. The RGD-5 carried 110 grams of explosives and detonated inside the houses with a lethal radius of 5 meters. The fighting in New York was as intense as in any area where Vyacheslav had fought. Tired, far from home for years, he kept on fighting. What else could he do besides survive? His contract would continue as long as the partial mobilization of 2022 was not ended. There was no set end to his stay in hell unless someone decided to finally put out the flames of that place where the demon roamed. At a certain point, a squad managed to capture a group of Ukrainians who were hiding. The men came out of the basement crouching before the Russian rifles. There were 3 of them kneeling under the invaders' aim. The leader of the Russian assault group called on the radio, reporting that they had prisoners. The response was short and direct. "Do not take prisoners." There was no time. It was to finish up and move on. One of the Russians pulled the trigger. The projectiles plunged into Ukrainian blood. The screams were short. The last breaths faded away as the ground turned red. Another scene where men's lives were ended by explicit orders. The Russian flag was raised on one of the buildings, announcing that New York was almost completely taken. The casualties were heavy, but the Russians kept advancing. The flag placed by the 9th Brigade fell soon after. Something was changing in the fighting. The conquest of the city could have been quick if it weren't for the new enemy that had just emerged. The drone descended over the house where the Russians were. The explosion was so strong that it bulged the building before the roof, and most of the walls collapsed on the men hiding inside. One of them groaned over the rubble. He was trying to get out when another drone exploded nearby. The smoke covered the wounded and weakened soldier for a moment. When everything cleared up, he was seen still moving. That earned him another drone exploding over his back. The Russian still moved after the impacts. The drone that was watching him now granted him the end of his suffering by dropping a grenade that finally ended his life. Something was changing in New York. It was a hunt with well-defined images of the Russian presence in the buildings, followed by absurd explosions capable of bringing down entire buildings, something that was more common from Russian aviation and artillery. Vyacheslav heard Lieutenant Mikola's orders on the radio. They were supposed to keep advancing, but in front of him, his comrades started to die. In the middle of the drone attacks, they had to run, even with the wounded asking for help on the ground. It was that or die. These new drones were dropping grenades wherever the soldiers were. Some were still in defensive positions, consolidating what had been taken when they were hit by the explosions. Those Russians were hunted down until their bodies were burning on the ground, motionless except for the crackling of flesh. There was a new brigade in the city. It arrived with the drone operators clearing the way for the assault teams. They put small observers in the air, then the kamikazes, and finally those drones the Russians called Baba Yaga. The last ones carried several explosives. It was no wonder they bore the name of the witch from Slavic folklore. Baba Yaga flew day and night to capture the souls of the Russians in New York. Piloted by men whom Vladimir Putin himself promoted as a Ukrainian monster that needed to be fought. The kamikaze drone followed the Russians among the trees until it identified the target. The soldier tried to run, but it was already too late. He crawled toward his wounded comrades, but Baba Yaga was already above, ready to take their lives with a single explosion. The men tried to hide in the shelters, but the 15-kilogram hexacopter could fly for a long time during its hunt. It was equipped with a signal repeater, anti-jamming equipment, batteries and directional antennas, not to mention thermal cameras to hunt the Russians at night or simply detect them better when they were hiding in the vegetation. These drones paved the way for the assault group of the 12th Azov Special Operations Brigade. Without a doubt, one of the most controversial groups within the Ukrainian armed forces. The grenade launcher fired one of the explosives at the Russian hideout, already covered by the smoke from previous attacks. The calm steps into the attic preceded the pulling of the trigger to cover the darkness with projectiles. When the Russians entrenched themselves, the kamikaze drone dove against their defenses, which burned them among the rubble or made them hide even more. The Ukrainian soldiers warned the enemies to come out. They threw grenades when there was no response. The explosion made some of the bears start to change their minds. One of them came out, but the others remained hidden in the darkness. But 2 grenades fell into the shadows. The explosion unleashed its energy against their bodies. The loss of those Russian lives broke the siege, allowing the Ukrainian soldiers to begin their withdrawal from New York. Meanwhile, the fighters of the 12th Brigade began taking the prisoners for interrogation and to find the killers who executed their compatriots. The 12th Brigade was born with the Azov Battalion in 2014 through the union of several movements during a turbulent time in Ukrainian politics when the pro-Russian president was deposed and forced to seek shelter under Putin's protection. At the time, the group fought the separatists alongside Oplot, which would later become one of the battalions in the war against Ukraine. When the war in Donbass began, and the Ukrainian armed forces suffered a series of defeats, it was militias formed by civilians, many of them in fact Russian speakers, who held back the advance of the separatists funded by Russia. The Azov battalion grew and played an important role in protecting Ukraine, but it must be made clear that there was something rotten within it. This can be clearly demonstrated by the Nazi symbols that some of its fighters carried or in some cases still carry. The current state and the influence of Russian propaganda on the proportion of neo-Nazis in the 12th Brigade can be debated, but even though this is probably highly exaggerated by propaganda, we should not overlook the clear and tacit rotten presence of this ideology, especially at the beginning of the battalion. A common argument is that the Azov battalion gave rise to the 12th Brigade, but the two are not the same thing today. The brigade, directly subordinated to the armed forces, had a large influx of people from all backgrounds who wanted to serve in special forces that had a strong presence against Russia. Even so, the problem existed and still exists, and the exaggerated and sensationalist Russian propaganda only makes it harder to fight, leading many to believe it's just a war fantasy created by the enemy. Vyacheslav, like a good Russian soldier, heard the whole story about the infamous Azov battalion, the Nazis who had taken over the Ukrainian government. He was thinking about that when he heard the bombs exploding over the enemy. He knew that the situation of the battle was no longer the same in New York. Still, he had to keep fighting. It was necessary to denazify Ukraine. Even if, for that, the Russians brought their own Nazis with the Ruzik battalion and had mercenaries led by a soldier with Nazi SS tattoos, like in the case of the Wagner group. All the propaganda was built from small truths, and two things were indeed true. One, yes, there was Nazi rot inside Ukraine. And the other was that the Azov battalion, even though they spoke Russian, had been a fierce enemy of Putin's intervention in Ukraine since 2014. This made for great war propaganda, amplifying everything, turning an entire country into Nazis and mobilizing Russian forces. Vyacheslav didn't go to war because of propaganda, but it was something that gave him strength in that hell during the 2 years he was fighting. The Russian bombings did not spare the Azov battalion. The shelling hit the houses where they stopped to rest. The rubble buried some of those men from the 12th Brigade, stopping the entire assault to save their fallen comrade. Among those men fighting were veterans of the siege of Mariupol. Some of them were captured by Russia and strangely released after so much propaganda about condemning them as terrorists. The soldier under the rubble was eventually rescued and evacuated. The battle had to go on. The Russians talked so much about Azov being one of their worst enemies that they had to prove it, just like they did at other times during the war. The 12th Brigade had its assault battalions operating in various locations across Ukraine, especially during the most desperate moments of the battles. Bakhmut, Kharkiv, and now near Toretsk. They surrounded another pair of Rufos, demanding their surrender. One of them came out of the bathroom, but the other resisted. The pulled triggers unleashed death. The first one kept crawling while the Ukrainians checked the bathroom. Seeing the corpse of the man who chose death, some of the Russians surrendered. Those who preferred to remain untouched received visits from grenades in their hiding places. Vyacheslav ended up among those prisoners. He managed to get out alive when so many of his comrades kept being hunted by Azov's drones. Soldiers hiding in trenches died piled up from the explosion of Baba Yaga's grenades. More deaths. Probably some soldiers still believed they shouldn't surrender to the Nazis, who would torture and kill them. So much propaganda that only led to more death in the chaos of war. But war, as always, was an extension of politics and therefore an art of lying and manipulating the masses.
It always was and always will be.